Note: the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of Three Gimbals.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Navigating in Balance, your favorite podcast by Three Gimbals, where each episode we dive into different arts and sciences of navigating complexity without losing your center of balance. I'm your host, Benjamin Butler. Today, we're going to be stepping into the shadows a little bit. So, counterintelligence is something that's evolving. It can be an invisible war. It's sometimes fought against our own ranks, sometimes the threats from the inside. So, how do we balance vigilance and trust, secrecy, transparency? Here to talk a little bit about that is Jeremy Clark of IXN Solutions. He has a background in counterintelligence and offers a pretty high level of insight into this high stakes world. So, with that being said, let's get started. Jeremy, if you could just take a minute or two, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, sure. First, Ben, thank you. And thanks to the Three Gimbals team for having me on this afternoon. Looking forward to the discussion. I'm very passionate about counterintelligence because I spent 26 years in it with the Army. I was focused mostly on strategic operations at the highest levels of the government for 26 years. When I retired as a W-4, I transitioned out onto the Intelligence Surveillance Reconnaissance Task Force and helped the Army modernize. The Army was a little bit behind when it comes to modernizing the intelligence disciplines, as the Secretary of the Army recognized. So we set up this task force focused strictly on finding vendor solutions that make the force better, faster, stronger, more lethal. So from collection all the way through PED processing down to get the information to the soldiers. I was specifically focusing on counterintelligence and human intelligence modernization for the Army at large. A lot of fun. I recognized there was a significant gap within counterintelligence, which I knew from my career, and I co-founded IXN, Identify, Exploit, Neutralize Solutions, where we focus on delivering kind of full service counterintelligence services across the spectrum of government and corporate entities, from training, consulting, all the way into our tech stack. But really looking forward to getting into the conversation, Ben, and thanks again for having me.
Course, yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for making time. Your background sounds super interesting, but before we get into any more specifics, let's just start out with something pretty basic. What is counterintelligence and what does it protect against?
I love this question. I'm going to tell you why. When I was growing up in the 8th and Airborne, it was CI human, one word, and there was no differentiation between the two. And as I grew up through my career, I quickly recognized there's a significant difference between counterintelligence, pause, and human intelligence. So with counterintelligence, I'm going to break it down into two words, and it's going to be equity protection. And that can be used across the government, and that can be used in the corporate side as well. There's people, there's information, and there's technology that need to be protected. What counterintelligence does is look inside the wire. Within a fob, within an organization, within an entity, we look internally to identify threats that are already in our ranks, or those threats trying to infiltrate the walls, no matter how high it is or how wide it is, those individuals coming in. So anything internal, if you will.
Gotcha. No, that's interesting because I think so often you hear of different threats and you picture some very overt, obvious enemy coming in, but you don't necessarily always know the shape in which that enemy will take. Sometimes it's within your walls, sometimes it's someone trying to get in through a back door. There's a myriad of different ways, that can happen. So, how is and why, I guess, is CI not just like I think a lot of people think it's a spy versus spy kind of counter espionage. They have this very Cold War picture of kind of a classical battle. How is this something that is critical for industries, agencies, startups today?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So first, when you think counterintelligence, a lot of people think strictly the human domain behind it. That's spy versus spy of the Cold War, right? Russia versus the US or the Soviets versus the US. But it extends beyond that. It's counter, pick an intelligence discipline. So it's counter signals intelligence. It's counter, again, just pick any discipline out there, cybersecurity. How is the adversary collecting against us and what are they trying to do? And counterintelligence is supposed to be full spectrum across the board to prevent an adversary from doing that. Again, from internal ranks or as they're trying to manipulate and get through our wire. Counterintelligence is full spectrum. And again, I think people often confuse it with strictly the human domain, although humans are often involved I think back to the World War II times, and there's a book called The Double Cross System. And what they talk about is using counter imagery as the airplanes would fly over the various sites, either the German or the British, as they would fly over sites. The Germans would set up telephone poles looking out of bunkers to make it look like tanks were there. And then conversely, the British, they were doing the same thing. They were manipulating the battle space through imagery intelligence. That is counterintelligence for the imagery type of capabilities out there. But, looking at the spy versus spy concept and how it kind of transitions from government to the corporate world, because I do think it's fairly new and fairly recent where kind of companies are taking a look at the threats they pose. But, the government, I often say, has classified information, and there's very regimented and protected. There's the NISPOM, there's the C3, if you have a security clearance for compliance. But corporate entities out there, they may not have policies, but they have proprietary information. Proprietary information can be protected just like classified information. Companies can establish policies, and we'll probably get into it in a little bit, but they can train their force, they can have reporting mechanisms. So it kind of transcends across government into the corporate side.
That makes sense. And on that note, I'd imagine too, with the rise of things, like as cyber threats continue to grow more and more advanced, and you have adversaries utilizing really high level techniques to exploit cyber networks now that everything is connected, both in business and in government. And now, especially with AI, with the rise of AI and how that's kind of come to the forefront, how has the CI landscape changed in the wake of those things?
Yeah, the adversary has easy access to us. When I think about technology and what counterintelligence is going to have to deal with, if you look at the Cold War timeframe, it was spy versus spy, or was those type of elements taking place. But let's talk about LinkedIn for a minute and the adversary's ability to just to have reach. We're all very prolific on LinkedIn. I think it's oftentimes egos get involved, and we put all these titles and our positions, our whole resume, and our whole profile of what we've done for our entire career is out there. That's used against us often. I've seen China reach out to multiple people just based on a profile of searching. And what they do is they cast a huge net. So just LinkedIn alone, the ability to have reach for the adversary and just pinging multiple people is very easy. It's cost effective, and it doesn't really tip the scales of concern, unfortunately, for a lot of people out there. They'll get an invitation that says simply something like this: hey, we've recognized that you're an expert in this particular craft. They make them feel good because it's a little ego up. We really are interested in knowing more about this topic. You go up again, people feel good, those dopamine kicks in. We would like for you to come teach a class or write a white paper for us, and we'll give you a little bit of money. It doesn't sound that alarming up front, but as you dissect it a little bit, the adversary employs this technique and people respond to it, even though training is out there that says don't do it.
Right.
I think just like LinkedIn, the net that's cast out there is huge. Now, are cybersecurity tools tipping the scales of preventing this? They're not.
Wow.
They're not doing it. I think it's going to go back to training, to be honest, Ben. A force needs to be trained, an employee base needs to be trained on what real threats look like. We can talk about historical cases like Aldrich Ames. You could talk about Robert Hansen, Pollard, all these cases out there. They're historic. They're the old way of doing things. The adversary is adapted to technology, and their approaches are a little bit different. That's why I think as counterintelligence professionals out there in the corporate or the government side, we need to understand the threat and need to teach and train the employee base what the threat looks like right now.
I understand where you're coming from on that. And I personally have heard of that LinkedIn example multiple times. It's crazy how it really is an ego based play if you think about it. And it's whereas, 30 years ago, an adversary may have approached somebody in person or at a conference. Now you can send out 1,000 messages, to your point, to 1,000 different people. And maybe even if one responds and takes the bait, well, that's a great use of your time and your money that you're sinking into this espionage program. So I think so often part of the issue is that employees at a, let's just use an industry, private industry as an example. You're not thinking about the fact that you're at the center of a global espionage operation. You think, hey, I'm just a subject matter expert and I am getting paid a couple $100, $1,000, couple $1,000 for sharing some of my expertise. I think that's such a mental roadblock that people will have to get through. I mean, to your point of good training.
Yeah, it's funny, we're talking strictly about like a foreign adversary. When I think about the corporate side, a foreign adversary can be a competing company. I look back at Google and I look back at Apple. So you have Bill Gates and you have Steve Jobs. Early on in their career, they kind of kept hands off each other's employees. It was like a no-go territory. All of a sudden, and I believe it was Bill Gates, started to hire away Apple people. Hey, and you know what they would show up with? That technology from Apple. Here's what Steve is working on. Here's what Apple's working on. And what did Microsoft do? Of course, they started to incorporate that. So there's a long line of this happening at the corporate side, and there's no foreign adversary involved. I find this case pretty interesting because Steve Jobs actually called Bill Gates, and what he had said was, "Hey, Bill, it looks like our policies are different. My policy is we're not going to hire from you guys. I thought that was unsaid, but you guys clearly are doing that. I simply have one question. Whose policy needs to change?" And he hung up the phone. But he basically called him out and said, "Stop stealing my people and technology away from me, or I'm going to start reciprocating." But again, going back just to the corporate side, it could be a foreign entity. It could also be a competing company.
And I believe it was in the headlines recently. I read something about the names are escaping me, but I think it's a human resources software. There are two competing companies where it was kind of a high profile incident where you had one company essentially send someone undercover to be hired somewhere else, learn practices, and then report back, and it all blew up when the person was caught. I think the story goes that this employee that had been hired literally ran out of the building when they were discovered. So, I mean, that reads like something out of a comedy spy movie or something like that, but it happens. And so, I mean, yeah, to your point, that just shows, you got to have these mechanisms in place to, have this training, have the ability to detect when, hey, we have a threat kind of inside of our ranks. But like, okay, taking it back, like we've kind of touched a little bit on industry, taking it to some very, very high profile technology related thefts and the threat that presents. I believe it was a pretty well known fighter jet program within the US that, somehow those plans made their way into the hands of an adversary. And wow, I guess they have a jet that looks a lot like ours. So how do those things tend to go down?
I do recall that. I think it's the B-52. It's
I
funny
think so.
because our jet, number one Arsenal plane, looks a lot like what China does because they
Right.
probably ripped it off.
Right. And they've been doing it for years.
They have. China, I mean, they are the emerging threat. They are really aggressive at what they're trying to do. And if you look at the different elements that need to come together, so first of all, you need a plan that says, here's our plan to create this particular component. And let's just talk about the plane, the B-52. An engineer designs it, and they come up with a plan. Now, first step is to resource, where are we going to get the materials from? And you're going to get the materials from all over the world, the components, whether the microchips or the fiber that's put together for the copper wiring and all these things, right? They all spread across the world. It's a global kind of supply chain going on. So, China has probably very well inserted themselves at some of these levels we've not thought about. So when we're resourcing and sourcing for copper, China could insert something potentially in a copper wiring or in a fused system. You look at microchips, it's a little bit more easier to explain. A microchip, good Lord, they're made in Taiwan. A lot of the stuff we use, China's right across the border. I'm sure that they see the utility to have some type of backdoor, some type of program put in there that can corrupt or manipulate that system so when we need it the most, they flip a switch and it makes it null and void, which scares me big time for the forces out there in the US military. But China's become very good at piecemealing and stealing information for years. And I think that's why it's the second oldest profession in the world is stealing or human intelligence or spy. The
Right.
spy craft is it's cheaper to steal it than it is to R&D it. Even if the R&D has gone bad, at least they they've got a starting point of we know not to go this way. So we'll take what we can, even if it's not good technology, we'll refine it and make it better.
No, absolutely. And I think too, what you're seeing with the proliferation of microchips and the ability to project reconnaissance essentially infinitely further than what you could even a decade, 2 decades ago. I think we're seeing that play out on the battlefield in some really real ways. You look at DJI and what that company has been able to do, even though it is a private company, but being a Chinese entity technically, or having falling under their espionage laws and their national policy, they have, I mean, they're the dominant consumer off the shelf drone on the market. It's been used widespread both sides in Russia and Ukraine. You see them all over the world, and essentially China's got reach back capability on that, which I know is kind of a scary thought in terms of from a threat perspective, and just kind of increases and underscores the importance of having a top to bottom counterintelligence program, not just in the end of the supply chain, but all the way up and down the chain, which I'd imagine adds a layer of difficulty in terms of implementation.
That sure does. Good Lord. Because you're not just looking at the supply chain, you're looking at employee reporting, foreign contact, or employee travel. And it could just be suspicious activity reports. We can get to that in a minute. You mentioned China a couple times, and so have I. And, their government's very good at stealing the information. But, looking at the corporate side, are you familiar with Leon Ding at Google?
I think so. I believe so.
So he was a software engineer. He worked on their core, their generative AI. That is the heart and soul of Google. And what this individual did, and this is a failed program to me, a failed counterintelligence program, but this particular individual was hired on to work that generative AI coding for Google. Again, that's that heart and soul. What Leon did was there was a policy that Google employees have to report foreign travel. There was no checking up on it. Leon ended up traveling multiple times to China, and he logged in to the website, VPN'd into Google to continue to work on the code. Well, unfortunately, cybersecurity tools didn't pick up the VPN login, and that's unfortunate. What he also did, he asked a fellow employee, hey, I'm going to be in China for a couple months on travel. Here's my physical badge. Can you badge me in to make it look like I'm here? Now, mind you, Ben, there are security cameras up that when he badged in, but it didn't pick up his fellow employee badging him in, but it made it look like Leon was there. If we fast forward a little bit after he ripped off hundreds of thousands of documents of this generative AI code, which finally tipped the scales of a cybersecurity tool after we were sending it from using a rather rudimentary type of mechanism, using a Dropbox from Google, pulling it into his personal computer. Ultimately, what he did, he set up his own company in China. When he was in China, he worked with the Chinese government to establish this company to sell the generative AI code of Google, to set up his own company to compete against Google. Now, he did that. Luckily, thankfully, this idiot returned to California and he got rolled up last year. But it wasn't until after he already gave China the generative AI code. I fear Google. But if I look at a counterintelligence program, an effective counterintelligence program, and I don't want to badmouth Google, this is strictly my opinion. The policies that are set up, what are we doing to check to make sure people are reporting foreign travel and foreign contact? Leon Ding had both. There was no follow-up to confirm or refute it. The physical access badge to get in, should it be looked at by the chief security officer every so often? Maybe. The logs that were being pulled, it did tip the scales finally, but why did it take so long? And then more importantly, how can Leon convince a fellow employee to badge him in? That goes back to training to me, the employee force, the suspicious activity, the culture that was created. Boy, for Leon just to be able to do that at Google, somebody should have caught that before he actually pulled the trigger and gave this code away. That's a failed CI program to me. I'm hopeful Google will learn from it. And I only talk about it because companies need to understand. You need to understand what you need to protect. You need to train the force on what threats look like so they know what to report. You need to check up on the policies that are already out there to make sure employees are following up on those particular policies. And then if there's an incident and an employee catches it, you need to have a mechanism to report it to the CISO, the CSO, the Insider Threat Program Director, somebody in that particular company.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a pretty powerful example of a very high profile company with a lot of resources, a lot of money probably invested into their security, and that level of failure is frankly pretty shocking and scary to think about. That being said, 2025, where we're at now, where do you see CI continuing to evolve, and what would be some essential principles? Kind of building on what you just said, you laid out a pretty good roadmap of here are some things you need to follow to at least implement an effective CI program. Where do you see that continuing to go, and where are areas of particular threat or where companies or entities will need to stay vigilant moving forward?
Yeah, good question. 2025. If we look at what happened 40 years ago in 1985, it was called the Year of the Spy. What we're couching at IXN right now is the Year of Counterintelligence because we need to get ahead of it. If we look at the National Defense Strategy, it says the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. I think that is very deliberately put it there because our focus was in the Middle East for so long. We were tracking down bad guys and terrorists. We forgot about, Russia, China, North Korea, these traditional near-peer competitors. They're in our backyard right now, and they're actively collecting against us. And I think that's why the National Defense Strategy says the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. For the government out there, I see investigations and espionage cases rolling to arrest all the time. Great job. I'm glad we're catching real bad guys. My soul dies a little bit every time I see one of those, though, because we've lost. They've already done something bad. We need to get ahead of that. And I think first it starts with a training mechanism, whether the agents need to be trained better to get out there to do a covering agent program to the various entities that they need to cover, whether it's research and development, whether it's units, the warfighter, the combatant commands across the government spectrum. You need to get out there and engage the force, train them on what threats look like. We have to do that. Again, when I see an investigation, is bad news. For the corporate side, though, Ben, I think it's a little bit different. Corporate entities, right now, their lexicon is insider threat. That's the terms that they know. We're trying to change that culture a little bit. Insider threats, they don't understand the counterintelligence aspect to it. I like to say insider threats are identified and defeated by counterintelligence practices. We're taking that domain counterintelligence and applying it. For corporate entities out there, the number one requirement you should look at, what do you need to protect the most? If you have proprietary information or proprietary process, you need to have a policy in place that says this is the core of what we need to protect. Once they identify a requirement, they need to put policy in place that says here's how we're going to protect it. If a particular person like Leon Ding that works on the generative AI code is traveling overseas, he needs to report that. If a foreign individual approaches that particular person working on that proprietary or requirement or whatever it is for a company that makes them special, they need to report foreign contact. Then I think you go above and beyond that too. It's easy for the government because there's NISPOM and C3 requirements to report if you have a security clearance, foreign travel, foreign contact, suspicious activity reports, and anything personally that's changed in your life. Bankruptcy, marriage to a foreign national, and adopting a foreign national. You can take those principles and overlay it to the corporate side to protect what matters the most. So once you have a requirement, once you have policy developed, you have to train the force on what threats look like. You also have to train the force on what to report and how to report. Again, requirement, policy, training, then a reporting mechanism. How does an employee report an incident? The Army had a saying, every soldier is a sensor. And I believe that for every entity out there. It's a culture of protection. It's a culture of protection. Employees need to feel comfortable and understand how to report. Not that they're ratting out their neighbors or their friends or their coworkers or their peers, but they're trying to preserve the integrity of that particular company. So reporting mechanism. And then lastly, you need to stay engaged with the force. I love counterintelligence. I'm very passionate about counterintelligence. It probably stops there with a lot of different people. If I'm not actively getting out there in front of the client base or the employee base to explain what threats are doing right now, or to remind them how to report, we're failing. So an active presence across the company. That was pretty long-winded.
I think that's just helpful to get a broad overview in terms of where you see the threats going, how you can effectively combat that, whether on the government side or the corporate side. And finally, to close out, what makes IXN special? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so a couple of different things, right? I was in the government for 26 years. My partners have been in the government for probably 3, 4 decades as well. And what we're trying to do is trying to change the lexicon of counterintelligence. We're trying to be proactive and tailored to those approaches. So, when I see an investigation, we've already lost a little bit of my soul dies. Getting out there and proactively protecting. What we're doing is we've got 3 different pillars. The first one is our training. Training is the cornerstone to every program, whether we're training agents out there on full spectrum counterintelligence or whether you're training the employee base out there on what threats look like. It all starts from training. We have a practice for the agents out there, or people who do the craft of counterintelligence, called theory to practice, whereas brand new, we just came up with it. I've gone through several courses, a lot of different courses throughout my military career. They lecture and then they expect, go do it. Well, we've kind of broken it down a little bit different. We lecture, we provide a way to do it. We'll do an in-class demonstration of how to do a particular aspect of counterintelligence, and then we'll mentor that particular individual or particular class through those various wickets. So our T2P model, we call it training to practice, or theory to practice, excuse me. Our second pillar, if you will, is consulting. So if I look at small to medium-sized companies out there, their resources are stretched and they're limited. What companies offer out there are fractional legal advisors, fractional marketing officers. What we're trying to sell right now is a fractional insider threat program, a fractional counterintelligence team, where I guarantee if you hire somebody at 100K, they're not going to bring as much experience or maybe not as much knowledge. For a fraction of that cost, right now, our early adopter fee is 60K. We'll manage the whole program for you. We'll help you identify the requirements, set up the policy, do the training, and then engage the force for you. We're calling it the Virtual Insider Threat Program right now. Then our third pillar is our Technology X, where it's an employee reporting module right now, where it's easy for the defense industry base. They have requirements to report C3 and NISPOM, foreign travel, foreign contacts, suspicious activity reports. Policy, no process, we fix that. So Next does that. So we scale this out, though. We're going to transition into a full spectrum CI case management system with 4 different vectors: employee reporting, cybersecurity tools, open source data flows, and then a manual upload. What this will do is it'll pull all data together. We have a proprietary risk score based on counterintelligence to identify those most at risk or vulnerable to being insider threats based on those 4 vectors. Brand new to the market. We're going to get there very soon. We love our idea, and it's a proactive way to make sure we go out to an employee and say, hey, you're a little bit on the high risk score. Let's just talk. Let's sit you down. So we prevent individuals like Leon Ding doing bad things after the fact.
Wow. Well, that's an effective solution, but also one that's accessible to a broader group, especially with the ability to essentially function as the managers of a counterintelligence program from the outside. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that sounds great, that it's going to help a lot of people, a lot of companies, and a lot of hopefully pretty important things from getting to that investigation point, which to your earlier comment means that you kind of already have failed in a way, because some information, some technology, something has been lost at that point. With that said, Jeremy, I just wanted to thank you again for coming on this podcast. I think this has been a great educational lesson for me in terms of learning a little bit more about counterintelligence, but also just kind of walking through where you see it going, how it continues to evolve, what IXN Solutions is doing to move the ball in counterintel and really get the lexicon and the terms standardized across both industry and government so that people are on the same page. But with that said, this has been another episode of Navigating in Balance, a podcast by 3 Gimbals. Check us out on Spotify and YouTube. And if you like this podcast, give us a like, give us a follow, or subscribe. But again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.